Readings of Almighty God's words on the pursuit of the truth.
Why man must pursue the truth. With the development of the ages, with the development of mankind, with the operations of all things, and with the arrangements of God's hands and His sovereignty, guidance, and leadership, mankind, all things, and the very universe are marching ever forward. Mankind under the law, after being restrained by the law for thousands of years, was no longer able to uphold the law, and followed God's work into the next age, which God initiated, the Age of Grace. At the arrival of the Age of Grace, God commenced His work premised on the fact that He had sent prophets to foretell it. This phase of work was not as tender or desired as men imagined it to be in their notions, nor did it feel as good as they'd thought. Instead, from the outside, everything seemed to be going contrary to prophecy. Out of these conditions emerged the fact that man never would have guessed at. The fact of the flesh into which God had incarnated, the Lord Jesus being nailed to the cross. All this was beyond what man foresaw. From the outside, all this seemed to be a cruel, bloody occurrence, horrible to behold, yet it was the inception of God's putting an end to the age of law and initiating a new age. This new age is the Age of Grace that all of you now know. The Age of Grace seemed to have come in defiance of God's prophecies in the Age of Law. Certainly, it also came in the form of God's incarnate flesh being nailed to the cross. All these events happened so suddenly and so naturally, in conditions that were ripe for them. Such were the means God used to end the old age and usher in a new one, to bring about a new one. Though all that happened at the very beginning of this age was so cruel and bloody and unimaginable, and even sudden in its arrival, and nothing was as wonderful or tender as man had imagined. Though the opening scene of the Age of Grace was horrible to behold and heart-wrenching, what was the one thing in it worth celebrating? The end of the Age of Law meant that God no longer had to abide mankind's various behaviors under the law. It meant that mankind had taken a great stride forward, in line with God's work and His plan, into a new age. Of course, it also meant that the days of God's waiting had been shortened. Mankind entered a new age, a new era, which meant that God's work had taken a great step forward, and that His desire would gradually come to be realized as His work moved forward. The arrival of the Age of Grace wasn't so lovely at its beginning, but as God saw it, the mankind that was soon to arise, which was the mankind He wanted, was coming ever closer to His requirements and goals. This was a delightful and laudable thing, something worth celebrating. Though mankind nailed God to the cross, which was to man a sorrowful thing to see, the very moment at which Christ was nailed to the cross meant that God's next age, the Age of Grace, had come. And, of course, that God's work in that age was on the verge of its commencement. More than that, it meant that the great work of that instance of God's incarnation had been accomplished. God would face the people of the world as a victor, with a new name and image, and the contents of His new work would be opened and disclosed to mankind. And meanwhile, for mankind's part, they would no longer be continuously vexed by frequent violations of the law, nor would they be punished any longer by the law for having violated it. The arrival of the age of grace allowed mankind to emerge from God's previous work and enter a brand new work environment, with new steps for the work and a new method of work. It allowed mankind a new entry and a new life. And of course, it allowed a relationship to arise between God and man that was one step closer. Because of God's incarnation, man could come face to face with God. Man heard God's actual, real voice and words. Man saw the manner of his work, as well as his disposition, and so on. Man heard this with their own ears and saw it with their own eyes in every regard. They vividly experienced that God had truly and indeed come among men, that God truly and indeed was face to face with man, that God truly and indeed had come to live among mankind. Though the duration of God's work in that incarnation wasn't long, it gave mankind of the time a firm and solid experience of what it truly feels like for man to live together with God. And though those who experienced such things didn't do so for a long time, God spoke many words in that instance of his incarnation, and those words were quite specific. He did much work too, and had many people who followed him. Mankind definitively ended their life under the law of the old age, and came to a wholly new age, the age of grace. Having entered the new age, mankind no longer lived under the restraints of the law, but under new requirements and new words of God. Because of God's new words and new requirements, mankind developed a new life whose form was different, a life of belief in God whose form and content were different. This life came one step closer than the previous life under the law, to meeting the standards of God's requirements of man. God laid out new commandments for mankind, and he laid out new behavioral standards for mankind that were more accurate and more tuned toward mankind as they were then, as well as criteria and principles for man's views on people and things, and for their comportment and actions. The words he spoke then weren't as specific as the ones now, nor was there such a great volume of them as there is now. Yet to man then, who had just come out from beneath the law, those words and requirements were enough. Given the stature of people of the time and what they were equipped with, these were the only things they could achieve and attain. For example, God told people to be humble, to be patient, to be tolerant, to take up the cross, and so on. These were all more specific requirements God made of man in the wake of the law, ones that touched on how humanity is to be lived out. Beyond that, man, who had lived beneath the law, enjoyed a plentiful and steady flowing stream of grace, blessings, and other such things from God because of the arrival of the age of grace. Mankind in that age was living in a veritable bed of roses. Everyone was happy, and everyone was an apple of God's eye, a babe in his palm. They had to keep the commandments, and to have a few good behaviors besides ones that lined up with man's notions and imaginings. But for mankind, the enjoyment of God's grace was there in greater measure. People were healed of diseases caused by demon possession, for instance, and the foul demons and evil spirits in them were driven out. When people were in trouble or need, God would make exceptions for them and display signs and wonders, so that they would be healed of their various maladies, and their flesh would be sated, and they would be fed and clothed. There was so much grace and so many blessings for man to enjoy in that age. Apart from simply adhering to the commandments, mankind was, at the very most, to be patient, tolerant, loving, and so on. Man had no inkling of anything more that involved the truth or God's requirements of man. Because man was wholly intent on enjoying grace and God's blessings, and because of the Lord Jesus' promise of the time to man, man began habitually to enjoy God's grace, with no end in sight. Mankind thought that if they believed in God, they should enjoy God's grace, that was their rightful share. They didn't know, though, to worship the Lord of creation, or to assume the status of a created being, and to perform the duty of a created being, and to be a good created being. Nor did they know how to submit to God, or how to be loyal to Him, or how to accept His words and use them as the basis for their views on people and things, and their comportment and actions. Man was quite ignorant of any such things, and in addition to enjoying God's grace as a matter of course, man wanted to enter heaven after death as a matter of course, and there enjoy good blessings together with the Lord. What's more, the mankind that lived in the age of grace, which lived amid grace and blessings, mistakenly believed that God is just a merciful, loving God, that His essence is mercy and loving kindness and nothing else. To them, mercy and loving kindness were emblematic of God's identity, status, and essence. What the truth, the way, and the life meant to them was God's grace and blessings, or perhaps a way of simply taking up the cross and walking the path of the cross. This was all there was in the age of grace to people's knowledge of God and orientation toward Him, as well as their orientation toward and knowledge of mankind and people themselves. So, to turn to causes and get to the root, what was it exactly that led to these circumstances? No one is to blame. You can't blame God for not working, or not speaking more concretely or more thoroughly. And you can't push the responsibility off onto man either. Why? Man is created mankind, a created being. They emerged from the law and came to the age of grace. However many years of experience man may have had of God's work as it progresses, that which God bestowed on man, that which He did, was what man could obtain and what they could know. But outside of that, with what hadn't been done by God, what He hadn't said, and what He hadn't revealed, mankind had no ability to understand or know that. But to look at the objective circumstances and the bigger picture, when mankind, which had progressed for thousands of years, had come to the age of grace, their understanding could only go as far as that, and God could only do such work as He was doing. This is because what mankind, which had emerged from the age of law, needed was not to be chastised or judged, nor to be conquered, much less to be made perfect. There was only one thing mankind needed at that time. What was it? A sin offering, the precious blood of God. The precious blood of God, that sin offering, was the only thing mankind needed as they emerged from the age of law. So, in that era, because of mankind's needs and actual circumstances, the work God was then to do, was to offer up the precious blood of his own incarnation as a sin offering. That was the only way to redeem the mankind of the age of law. With his precious blood as the price and as the sin offering, God expunged mankind's sin. And it was not until their sin was expunged that man had the standing to come sinless before God and accept his grace and his continued guidance. God's precious blood was offered to mankind, and as it was offered up for mankind, mankind could be redeemed. What could mankind, which had just been redeemed, have understood? What did mankind, which had just been redeemed, need? Mankind would not have possessed the ability to accept it if they had immediately been conquered, judged, and chastised. They did not have such a capacity for acceptance, nor were their conditions such that they could have understood all this. So, in addition to God's sin offering, as well as his grace, blessings, tolerance, patience, mercy, and loving kindness, mankind, as they were at that time, could accept no more than a few simple requirements that God made of man's behavior. Those and no more. And as for all the truths that touch more deeply on man's salvation, which wrong ideas and views mankind has, what corrupt dispositions they have, what essences of rebelliousness against God they have, what the essence is of the traditional culture that mankind upholds, as we have recently fellowshipped about, how Satan corrupts mankind, and so on. Mankind at the time couldn't have understood anything at all. In such circumstances as those, God could only admonish and make requirements of mankind in the simplest ways, in the most straightforward ways, with the most rudimentary requirements for comportment. Therefore, mankind in the age of grace could enjoy only grace and enjoy without limit the precious blood of God as a sin offering. In the age of grace, however, the greatest thing had already been accomplished. And what was that? It was that mankind, which God was to save, had had their sin forgiven by the precious blood of God. This is a thing worthy of celebration. It was the greatest thing God did in the age of grace. Though man's sin was forgiven, and man would no longer come before God in the likeness of sinful flesh or as a sinner, having instead been forgiven of their sins by the sin offering and now qualified to come before God, man's relationship with God had not yet reached that of a created being with the Creator. It was not yet that of created mankind with the Creator. Mankind under grace was still far, far away from the role God requires of them, that of being the master and steward of all things. So, God had to wait. He had to be patient. What did it mean for God to wait? It meant that mankind then was to continue living amid God's grace, amid God's various modes of work of the age of grace. God wants to save much more than a handful of mankind, or one race. His salvation is far from limited to a single race, or those within a single denomination. So, the age of grace was to be undergone for thousands of years, just as the age of law had been. Mankind needed to keep living in the new age led by God year after year, generation after generation. How many eras man must undergo in this way? How many shifts in the stars? How many seas going dry and rocks wasting away? How many oceans giving way to fertile land? and they must undergo the different changes of mankind in various periods, and different changes taking place in the myriad things of the earth. And as they experienced all this, God's words, His work, and the fact of the Lord Jesus' redemption of mankind in the age of grace spread to the ends of the earth, throughout the streets and alleys, into every corner, until they were known to every household. And that is when that age, the age of grace, which came after the age of law, was meant to come to a close. The work God did in this period was not merely to wait silently. As He waited, He did work on the mankind of the age of grace in different ways. He continued His grace-based work, bestowing grace and blessings on the mankind of this age, so that His actions, His work, His speech, and the facts He worked and His will in the age of grace would reach the ears of every person whom He would choose. He enabled every person whom He would choose to be availed of His sin offering, so that they would no longer come before Him in the likeness of sinful flesh, as sinners. And though man's relationship with God was no longer that of never having seen Him, as in the age of law, but a step beyond that, as a relationship between believers and the Lord, between Christians and Christ, still, such a relationship is not the relationship that God ultimately wants between mankind and God, between created beings and the Creator. Their relationship then was clearly still quite far from the relationship between created beings and the Lord of creation. But compared to the relationship between mankind and God in the age of law, it represents a great advancement. This was cause for joy and celebration. But be that as it may, God still needed to lead mankind. He needed to lead mankind whose hearts' deep places were full of notions about God, and imaginings and requests, and demands and rebelliousness and resistance forward. Why? Because such a mankind may have known about enjoying God's grace, and they may have known that God is merciful and loving, but beyond that, they did not know the first thing about God's true identity, status, and essence. Because such a mankind has undergone Satan's corruption. Though they enjoyed God's grace, their essence and the various notions and thoughts in the pit of their heart remained counter to God and in opposition to Him. Man didn't know how to submit to God, or how to perform the duty of a created being, much less how to be a satisfactory created being. Even less than that, of course, was there anyone who knows how to worship the Lord of creation. Were the myriad things of the world handed over to corrupt mankind, corrupted as they were to such a degree, it would be the same as handing them over to Satan. The consequences would have been entirely the same, with nothing to distinguish them. So, God still needed to continue His work, to continue leading mankind into the next stage of work that He would do. That stage was something God awaited for a long time, something He looked forward to for a long time, and something He paid for with His prior patience for a long time. Now, at last, that mankind has enjoyed God's sufficient and abundant grace, this world and this mankind, as seen from any angle, have come to a level at which God will do His true work of saving mankind. They have come to the time when God will conquer and chastise and judge mankind, when He will express many truths to perfect mankind, and to gain a group from mankind who can be stewards of all things among those things. This time having come, God no longer needs to be patient, nor to continue leading mankind of the age of grace to live in grace. No longer does he need to keep providing for mankind of the age of grace, or shepherding them, or watching over them, or preserving them. No longer does he need tirelessly and unconditionally to provision mankind with grace and blessings. No longer does he need to be unconditionally patient with mankind in grace, as they greedily and shamelessly solicit his grace without worshiping him at all. What God will do instead of this is express his will, his disposition, the true voice of his heart, and his essence. During this time, God, while providing mankind with the manifold truths and words they need, is also pouring forth and expressing his true disposition, a righteous disposition. And in expressing his righteous disposition, it is not as though he vacantly offers a few phrases of judgment and condemnation and is done with it. Instead, he uses facts to expose mankind's corruption, their essence, and their satanic hideousness. He exposes mankind's rebelliousness, resistance, and rejection against him, as well as their various notions about him and betrayals of him. In this period, more of what he expresses is beyond the mercy and loving kindness he extends to mankind. It is the hatred, revulsion, aversion, and condemnation he has for mankind. This abrupt 180-degree turn or change in God's disposition and station catches mankind unprepared and makes them incapable of acceptance. God expresses his disposition and his words with all the sudden force of a lightning bolt. Of course, he also provides mankind with all they need with immense patience and tolerance. In different ways and from different angles, God speaks and expresses his disposition to mankind in ways that are the most fitting, proper, concrete, and direct ones with which to treat created beings, from the perspective of his stance as the Creator. Such are the ways of speech and work alike for which God has been longing in wait for 6,000 years. 6,000 years of longing, 6,000 years of waiting. These speak to God's 6,000 years of patience, containing his 6,000 years of anticipation. Mankind is still the mankind created by God. But having come through 6,000 years of ceaseless, star-shuffling, sea-swallowing change, they are no longer the mankind as created by God at the beginning, with that same essence. Therefore, as God begins to work on this day, the mankind he now sees, though what he expected, is also abhorred by him, and is, of course, too tragic for God to behold. I spoke of 3 things here. Do you remember them? Such a mankind, though they are what God expected, are also abhorred by him. What was the other thing? They are also too tragic for God to behold. These 3 things are all there in man at the same time. What was it that God expected? That such a mankind, after having experienced the law and then redemption, would walk at last unto today on a foundation of understanding some fundamental laws and commandments that man should uphold, and no longer be a simple mankind with a blank at the pit of their heart, as Adam and Eve were. Instead, they would have a measure of new things in their heart. Those things are what God expected that mankind would possess. Yet at once, mankind is a mankind that God abhors as well. So, what then is it that God abhors? Do you not all know? Mankind is filled with Satan's corrupt disposition, living a ghastly life, neither quite as man nor as demon. Mankind is no longer merely so simple as to be unable to withstand the serpent's enticement. Though mankind has their own thoughts and views, their own definite opinions, and their own ways of regarding the myriad of events and things, there is nothing at all of what God wants in mankind's views on people and things, or in their comportment and actions. Mankind can think and hold views, and they have their grounds, means, and attitudes for their actions. But all this of which they are possessed has its origins in Satan's corruption. It is all based on Satan's views and philosophies. When man comes before God, there is no trace of submission in their heart toward God, nor any sincerity. Man is saturated with Satan's toxins and filled with its education and thoughts, and its corrupt disposition. What does this indicate? God must speak a lot of words and do a great deal of work for man in order to change their mode of existence and attitude toward God, and more specifically, of course, in order to change their ways and criteria for their views on people and things, and their comportment and actions. Before all this has taken effect, mankind is an object of abhorrence in God's eyes. What is it that God needs when He saves an object of His abhorrence? Is there joy in His heart? Is there happiness? Is there solace? There is no solace at all, nor any happiness. His heart is filled with loathing. The only thing God will do in such circumstances, apart from speaking tirelessly, is exercise patience. This is the second element of what God feels toward such a mankind as is seen through His eyes: abhorrence. The third element is that they are too tragic to behold. In light of God's original intent in creating mankind, God's relationship with man is that of parent and child, of family. This dimension of the relationship may not be like mankind's blood relations, but to God, it exceeds mankind's fleshly blood relations. The mankind that God initially created is entirely different in likeness from the mankind He sees in the last days. In the beginning, man was of a simple and juvenile likeness, and though they were ignorant, their heart was pure and clean. One could see in their eyes the clarity and transparency deep in their heart. They didn't have the assorted corrupt dispositions that man has now. They had no intransigence, arrogance, wickedness, or deceit. And they certainly didn't have the disposition of being sick of the truth. From man's speech and acts, from their eyes, from their face, one could see that mankind was the one God created in the beginning, and the one He favored. But in the end, as God again regards mankind, man's heart is no longer so clear in its depths, and their eyes are no longer so clear. Man's heart is filled with Satan's corrupt disposition, and when they meet with God, their face, speech, and acts are detestable to him. However, there is a fact none can deny, and it is because of this fact that God says such a mankind is too tragic to behold in his eyes. What fact is that? It is this, which none can deny. God created this mankind, which has come once more before him, with his own hand, but they are no longer the mankind they were at the beginning. From man's eyes to their thoughts, and down to the pit of their heart, they are filled with resistance and betrayal against God. From man's eyes to their thoughts, and down to the pit of their heart, nothing less than Satan's disposition pours forth from them. Man's satanic dispositions of intransigence, arrogance, deceit, wickedness, and being sick of the truth pour forth, undisguisedly and naturally, from their gaze and their expressions alike. Even when faced with God's words or face to face with God, man's corrupt, satanic disposition and their essence, which is corrupted by Satan, pour forth in this way, undisguised. There's only one phrase that can capture what the emergence of this fact makes God feel, and that is, too tragic to behold. The mankind that has come unto today and unto this era has reached the level of God's requirements for the third and final stage of his work, that of the salvation of mankind, as much in terms of man's greater environment as in terms of each particular aspect of the situations and conditions in which people find themselves. Yet, even as God is full of anticipation for this mankind, he is full of hatred for them too. God, of course, still feels they are too tragic to behold, as he sees instance after instance of mankind's corruption. Yet, what is worthy of celebration is that God no longer needs to engage in pointless patience and pointless waiting on man's behalf. What he needs to do is the work for which he has waited for 6,000 years, that he has anticipated for 6,000 years, and that he has looked forward to for 6,000 years, that of expressing his words, his disposition, and every truth. Of course, this also means that among this mankind that God has chosen, there will arise the group of people that God has long awaited, those who will be the stewards of all things and become the masters of all things. To look at the situation as a whole, everything has strayed so far from what was expected. Everything has been so painful and sad. But what most merits God's happiness is that due to the passage of time and the different age, the days of mankind's subjection to Satan's corruption are already through. Mankind has been through the baptism of the law and God's redemption. Finally, they've come to the final step of the work God will do, the stage in which mankind is saved as the end result of their acceptance of God's chastisement and judgment and of his conquest. To mankind, this is without a doubt great news, and to God, it is certainly a thing that has been a long time coming. This, as seen from any angle, is the advent of all mankind's greatest era. As seen from any angle, be it that of mankind's corruption, or the trends of the world, or social structures, or mankind's politics, or the resources of the whole world, or that of the current disasters, mankind's outcome is near. This mankind has come to the end of the line. Yet this is the most climactic time in God's work, the time that most merits man's remembrance and celebration. And of course, it is also the advent of the most important and critical time, the time in which mankind's fate is decided, in the 6,000 years of God's work on His management plan. Therefore, whatever has happened to mankind, and however long God has waited and exercised patience, it has all been worth it. Let us return to the topic we set out to discuss: why man must pursue the truth. God's management plan is split into 3 stages of work among mankind. He has already finished the prior 2 stages. To look at those stages up until the present, whether it be the law or the commandments, their utility for man was nothing more than having them uphold the law, the commandments, God's name, the faith in the recesses of their heart, a few good behaviors, and a few good tenets. Man fundamentally fails to live up to the standard of God's requirement, that of being the steward of all things and becoming the master of all things. Is that not so? They fundamentally fail to live up to that. If man, who has been through the law and the age of grace, were made to do what God requires them to do, they would only be able to engage with all things by means of the law or of the grace and blessings bestowed on them in the age of grace. This falls far short of God's requirement that man should be the steward of all things, and mankind falls far short of accomplishing the things God requires them to do, and the responsibility and duty He requires them to fulfill. Man just cannot meet or live up to the standard of God's requirement that they should be the masters of all things, and the masters of the next age. Therefore, in the final stage of His work, God expresses to man and tells them all the truths mankind needs, and the principles of practice they need, in all their aspects, so that man may know what the standards of God's requirements are, how they should engage with all things, how they should regard all things, how they should be stewards of all things, what the mode of their existence should be, and in what manner they should live before God, as true created beings under the dominion of the Creator. Once man has understood these things, they also know what God's requirements for them are. Once they have fulfilled these things, they will also have fulfilled the standards of God's requirements of them. Given that the law, commandments, and simple criteria for behavior are no substitute for the truth, God expresses a great many words and truths in the last days that have to do with man's practice, their comportment and actions, and their views on people and things. God tells man how to view people and things, and how to comport themselves and act. What does it mean that God tells man all of this? It means that God requires you to view people and things, and to comport yourself and act according to all these truths, and thereby to live in the world. Whatever sort of duty you perform, and whatever sort of commission you accept from God, His requirements of you don't change. Once you have understood God's requirements, you are to practice, perform your duty, and accomplish God's commission of you according to His requirements as you understand them, regardless of whether He is beside you or scrutinizing you. It is only in this way that you may truly become a master of all things in whom God is assured, and who is qualified, and who is worthy of His commission. Does this not touch on the topic of why man must pursue the truth? Do you understand now? These are the facts that God will bring about. So, pursuing the truth isn't simply about casting off one's corrupt disposition and not resisting God. There is a greater significance and a greater value in the pursuit of the truth we are talking about. Truly, it involves man's destination and their fate. Do you understand? Why must man pursue the truth? In a small sense, this is addressed by those most basic doctrines that man understands. In a grand sense, the foremost reason is that, to God, pursuing the truth involves His management, His expectations of mankind, and the hopes that He entrusts to mankind. This is one part of God's management plan. It can be seen in this, that whoever you are and however long you have believed in God, if you do not pursue the truth or love it, you will inevitably end up as one who is to be cast out. This is plain as day. God does 3 stages of work. He has had a management plan since He created mankind, and He has gone on to effect each of its stages, one by one, in mankind, and to lead mankind step by step to the present. How great the heartfelt care and the price He has paid forth, and how long He has endured toward the ultimate goal of working the truths He expresses, and every facet of the criteria of His requirements, which He tells mankind on man, turning those into man's life and reality. As God sees it, this is such an important matter. God places such weight on it. God has expressed so many words, and before He did a great deal of preparatory work. If in the end you do not pursue or enter these words now that He has expressed them, how will God view you? What sort of designation will God assign you? This is plain as day. So, every person, no matter your caliber or age or the number of years you have believed in God, should put your efforts toward the path of pursuing the truth. You shouldn't emphasize any objective rationales. You should pursue the truth unconditionally. Don't idle your days away. If you seek and put your efforts toward the pursuit of the truth as the great matter of your life, it may be that the truth you gain and can reach in your pursuit is not what you'd have wished for. But if God says He will give you a destination depending on your attitude in your pursuit and your sincerity, then how wonderful that will be. Don't focus on what your destination or outcome will be for now. What will happen and what the future holds. Whether you will be able to avoid disaster and not die. Don't think of these things or ask after them. Concentrate only on pursuing the truth in God's words and His requirements, on performing your duty well, on satisfying God's will, on not proving unworthy of God's 6,000 years of waiting, His 6,000 years of anticipation. Give God some comfort. Let Him see some hope for you, and let His wishes be realized in you. Tell me, would God mistreat you if you did so? Of course not. And even if the end results aren't as one would have wished, how should they treat that fact as a created being? They should submit in all things to God's orchestrations and arrangements, without any personal agenda. Is this not the perspective created beings should take?
It is.
That's the right mindset. We'll conclude our fellowship on the main thrust of why man must pursue the truth with that.